Now, the ceasefire, which was long ignored, finally came to an end in Sri Lanka at the beginning of this year. Is it the government's intention now to eradicate the Tamil Tigers?
Actually, the government is looking at providing space for all moderate Tamil parties to also come in and take their proper place in the political spectrum. What has happened is, as long as the LTT was strong and the LTT was in the dominant position that they were in, it was impossible for any other Tamil group, a moderate Tamil voice, to come in and make their voices heard. So it was essential that the terrorism had to be dealt with if the other groups had to be given the space to make their voices heard.
But my point is that there have been ceasefires in the past, there have been all-out government offensives against the Tigers in the past, and this civil war has not ended and gives no sign of ending. And you, as the governor of the central bank, must find your heart sinks when ceasefires are abandoned and the war is back on in full force.
Yeah, we got to admit that it's always tougher to run an economy when there is some conflict going on rather than when it's not there. But today the challenge is that many countries have had to face threats of terrorism in dealing with their own economies. And sometimes it is essential that we put it back and put it behind us if we are to really move forward. And that's the position that we are taking too, because for people to come in and invest in Sri Lanka, we have to ensure that we provide them a safe environment.
Well, you can't do that, can you? You certainly can't put the war behind you or put it on a shelf and pretend it's not happening. For a start, you have to spend $2 billion or more a year funding the war.
Well, it's a little less than that. But nevertheless,
we
spend something like 3.8% of our GDP on the war and on the defense, which is something similar to what lots of other countries also spend. For example, Singapore spends 4.9% of their GDP. And,
with respect, a country like Sri Lanka, where 45% of the population live on less than $2 a day, it makes no sense whatsoever from an economic point of view that you spend upwards of $2 billion a year on defense.
Actually, that figure may not be entirely correct, because
which one?
Yeah, the 4.45%. Sri Lanka had 22.7% of its population below the poverty line in the year 2002. But last year, the latest figures that have come out show that it has come down to 15.2%. So there has been an appreciable drop in poverty as well in Sri Lanka. And that, mind you, has been in the context of the amazing amount of difficulties that we have been having, which shows that we have a resilience in our economy, which is what this entire thing is all about.
But foreign investors are nervous. The ceasefire has collapsed, the war is on in full force. Foreign investors, for example, the Japanese telecom giant NTT, is pulling out of a major investment with your own Sri Lankan telecom company.
Yeah. But if you really see, the Japanese investor has sold out at a profit to a Malaysian investor. And Sri Lanka's foreign direct investment was the highest ever last year, at $751 million, was the highest ever figure that we have ever recorded. And then when Sri Lanka went for a bond issue just in October last year, we went for a $500 million, and we had subscriptions for $1.6 billion.
Well, of course you did. We know why you did, because you were offering the most extraordinarily high interest rate, over 8.25% interest rate.
Yeah, true enough. But still, for all, that is about the level of interest that any country which has a rating such as ours would be able to offer.
Because your credit rating is sunk.
Yeah, but
and the reason is because people look at Sri Lanka and they look at an economy in a wartime situation which looks extraordinarily fragile. That's why you're burdening yourselves with these enormous interest rates to service your foreign debt, because you find it difficult to establish your creditworthiness.
No, it's really not that simple. If you look at it overall, if you look at the macroeconomic numbers that Sri Lanka has been able to generate, our growth has been at nearly 7% for 3 years running. And that, mind you, with the kind of environment that you're talking about. Our unemployment is the lowest ever at 5.4%, is the same as the the UK unemployment rate. Our reserves have been the highest at $3.5 billion. So you have seen, and our exchange rate is stable now. There are many plus factors that are in the Sri Lankan economy, which sometimes we have not been seen in perspective, particularly because the conflict has been the item that has been taken the front page.
I take your point, and it is your job as Governor of the Central Bank to put a positive spin on Sri Lanka's economic performance, but one looks at the international agencies that rate, for example, your country's creditworthiness, and Fitch, which is highly respected, has downgraded your creditworthiness, and one looks at the IMF report, which focused on inflation, which they say is well above 20%, and they say is not the result of international commodity price inflation, for example, oil or other foodstuffs. It is the result of, in their words, poor economic management at home.
Yeah. Firstly, that particular report is not the IMF report. It has been a staff report. IMF gives out what is known as the Article 4 surveillance report. And that report, which the IMF takes responsibility for, does not contain any such number like what you just mentioned.
So you're saying inflation doesn't run at all?
No, I'll explain to you exactly how it works. The report that you quoted from is a staff report which has been very poorly structured, and we have in fact made it known to the IMF that we do not agree with it at all.
With great respect, I think our audience might struggle to see the difference between an IMF report which is a staff report and an IMF report which is an official report. The fact is, IMF people have been looking at your economy, they talk about poor domestic management, and they talk about an inflation rate which is dangerously high.
No, I'll just explain to you, because IMF report, the official IMF report, now the UK also has an IMF report, which is the Article 4 report. And that Article 4 report is a positive one as far as Sri Lankan economy is concerned. We do have headline inflation, which is high, and we appreciate that, as if you say so, and we also
you
are the first.
It's over 20%.
Yeah, absolutely. But it is simply the cause that has been as a result of the very high commodity prices all over the world.
Well, of course,
if you look at the core inflation,
the report we're arguing about specifically says that is not the case. And one only has to look at neighbouring countries which have the same sorts of problems with a high oil price that you have, where inflation is not running at over 20%.
But you will find that in many countries, their inflation has risen by about 50%. You see, the way inflation is calculated is not the same all over the world. It's not a steady standard method. But what we have seen in Sri Lanka, yes, our headline inflation has gone up, but the core inflation, now what you mean by core inflation is the increase in your prices without taking food as well as energy into account. US does it the same way. Philippines, Canada, all those countries takes the core inflation, which is without food and without energy. Now, if you take the core inflation of Sri Lanka, which is the demand-driven inflation, which we have to be managing, that you will find is between 7 to 8%.
Without wishing to get too technical, it seems to me that Sri Lankans, when they consider their lives today, are going to look at the fact that the price of rice, of bread, of oil, cooking oil, has gone up between 2 and 3 times in little more than a year, and they're going to say to themselves, we are living in a war economy, we're spending more and more on this battle against the Tamil Tigers, and our own living conditions are worsening.
Yeah, but that's also not really accurate, because if you look at the Sri Lankan per capita, it is $1,617, up 50% over the last 3 years. And mind you, these are the last 3 years that you mentioned were the tough years for us. So what it means is there has been huge economic turmoil right across the world. Now, all the countries in the world are today grappling with inflation. The oil prices, what you missed, have gone up 3.5 times over the last 4 years. It's a huge number, and we import every single drop of oil to Sri Lanka.